Bob Ferguson is still acting like the world's best moderate. I just don't know when he's going to drop it. So for those of you who've lived in Washington state long enough, you'll remember when Jay Inslee first ran for governor 12 years ago, and he ran as a moderate too. And I would say Washington Democrats were far more moderate at the time, but for instance, he ran saying he wasn't going to raise taxes. Remember? And that lie lasted all of like 1 year. So I don't know if Bob Ferguson's charade is going to be able to keep up for more than Jay Inslee's did, but he's sure acting like it. So he did this wide-ranging interview with the Seattle Times. And in it, I mean, he literally sounds, if this is actually who he was and who he'd always been, I wouldn't have that big of a problem with Bob Ferguson. He's totally pretending to be a different person. So the headline, Governor-elect Bob Ferguson's early approach to fix Washington's $10 billion budget deficit. So they sat down with him, talked to him for an hour about basically what's coming up in the legislative session and how he would contend or will have to contend with this budget deficit. It says Governor-elect Bob Ferguson says he's not ready to back tax increases just yet. He said, we're looking at savings, efficiencies, how we can do better as a state. That's the first, second, and third conversation as far as I'm concerned before even entertaining anything else. Oh, that sounds great. That sounds great. He says we need to look for cuts and efficiencies before we even entertain new tax increases. I mean, never mind that when Bob Ferguson was on the King County Council, he signed off on $1 billion in new taxes. So he's not a fiscal conservative. He's pretending to be a fiscal conservative because that's what he ran as. Remember one of his first ads talking about the crushing costs for families. So can he really turn around 2 months later and be like, new taxes for everyone? So it's a facade. It's a charade. I don't know how long he's going to keep it up, but that's not who he is. And then it goes on to talk about some other priorities that Democrats have pushed in the past, some really fringe stuff and whether he'd support it. Again, non-committal. It says Ferguson was also non-committal on some top legislative priorities of progressive Democrats and their allies, which may wind up on his desk for a signature or veto in the next several months. That includes a bill giving striking workers access to unemployment benefits, which passed in the State House last year. So he's playing coy with the Seattle Times on this. You really freaking think that if a Democratic governor gets a bill to his desk that would pay striking workers, so a bill backed by unions, which are the primary donors to every Democrat in the state of Washington, which absolutely hold the purse strings and guard the gate to the governor's office, you really think Bob Ferguson would veto it? I love that the Seattle Times is even entertaining the idea that Bob Ferguson would veto a bill that came to his desk to pay striking workers. Like, they're totally buying his moderate game of pretend, hook, line, and sinker. And then it says, oh God, okay, what's the other fringe policy that didn't make it across the finish line last year? Rent control, right? Okay, where's he on that? Similarly, Ferguson didn't commit in the interview to supporting a bill to cap annual rent increases. Shocking. Won't commit to that either. Another proposal that passed the State House last year but died the Senate. However, he has directed his transition team's housing subcommittee to come up with a recommendation on a, quote, balanced law that prohibits predatory rent increases. So rent control. So he's like, no, I can't say for sure whether I'm going to do that. But he's told his subcommittee on housing to come up with a recommendation for a law that prohibits predatory rent increases. So yeah, again, still playing coy. Here's the one that really floored me, right? Ferguson said he has no problem with deportations of individuals who are criminals under existing policies and law, and acknowledged the president has broad legal authority on immigration, but he said he's preparing for if Trump pushes past legal boundaries. So here's the guy who sued the Trump administration 100 times, who we're supposed, and one of those was for the kids in cages lie, and we're supposed to believe he has no problem with deportations of individuals who are criminals under existing policy and law. That would be everyone who's in the country illegally, right? Because you're a criminal if you're in the country illegally. You committed a violation. So Bob Ferguson is really saying he has no problem if Trump comes in door to door and deports illegal immigrants in our state? Of course he does. Of course he would absolutely have the state sue over it in seconds. Like, he has whole aspects of his transition team that are dedicated to fighting against Donald Trump preemptively. So it's like this whole moderate thing is hilarious to me, this like act that he's portraying, and the Seattle Times just goes with it. Like, no pushback to, hey, you know, you say that you're kind of skeptical about raising taxes, but you raised taxes $1 billion while you were on the King County Council. While you were the attorney general, you literally doubled the size of your office, which of course doubled costs for Washingtonians. And now you want to act like a fiscal conservative? Don't you think that would be the job of a journalist? It was also like, gag. They say that he came in and he sat down for an hour-long interview with no entourage. They literally say that in the Seattle Times article. He had no entourage with him. Like, oh, how big of him. Oh my God. He's a man of the people.
Oh, yeah.
He is a man of the people. But all of these things, again, on the union thing, don't you think a good journalist would push back on the assertion that Bob Ferguson would even consider vetoing a bill that was being pushed by the unions, that made it to his desk, that passed both the House and the Senate? They're not in a million years. And journalists think it's not their job to say that. Yeah, it is. It's your job so your readers know what's realistic and not realistic. Like Bob Ferguson says this, however, here's how much money he got from unions. Here's how much money he got from unions in his run for the governor's office. Bob says this about new taxes, except here's what he did when he was on the King County Council and in the Attorney General's office. That's journalism. This is stenography. This is shameful stenography. So yeah, Bob Ferguson, you're not a moderate. We see you. We see you for what you really are. It'll only be a matter of time before you reveal your true self.